If God knew Satan would rebel, if God knew that rebellion would bring temptation, suffering, deception, and death into the world, why did God create him at all? It's one of the most difficult questions a Christian can ask. Because if God knows everything, Satan's rebellion couldn't have surprised him. God knew the serpent would appear in Eden. He knew humanity would fall. He knew evil would enter his creation. And yet, God created. So why? The answer begins with something Scripture makes clear. Satan was not created evil. The Bible describes him as a created being who became evil through rebellion. Jesus says in John 8:44 that the devil was a murderer from the beginning and did not stand in the truth, and throughout Scripture Satan is presented as a fallen spiritual being who opposes God. That means evil wasn't something God originally built into Satan, it was something Satan chose, and this distinction is crucial. God created creatures capable of serving him, loving him, and obeying him. But genuine obedience requires a real choice. If a creature has absolutely no ability to reject God, its obedience becomes something closer to programming than a meaningful relationship. And this brings us to a difficult truth about freedom. God could create beings who could only obey. But Scripture shows us that God created rational creatures with genuine moral responsibility. Angels could rebel. Human beings could rebel, and tragically some did. But here's where another question appears. If God knew they would rebel, why not simply prevent it? Because God's knowledge of an event is not the same thing as God's causing that event. Think about the difference between knowing what someone will choose and forcing them to choose it. God's foreknowledge doesn't make him the author of Satan's rebellion. Satan chose pride. Satan chose opposition to God. Satan chose evil. God knew the choice would happen. But knowing is not causing. And Scripture never presents God as the author of evil. James 1:13 says that God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. So God didn't create Satan with a sinful nature and then punish him for having it. He created a good being who turned away from his Creator. But then we reach the part of the story that is even more difficult. Why didn't God destroy Satan immediately? The Bible doesn't give us every detail about God's decision. And this is where we have to be careful. We shouldn't pretend Scripture answers questions it doesn't answer. But Scripture does reveal something powerful. God is able to take what evil intends and accomplish his purposes through it without becoming the author of evil. We see this repeatedly. Joseph's brothers intended evil against him. Yet Joseph later told them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." The greatest example is the cross. Satan opposed Christ. Human authorities condemned him. Jesus was betrayed, beaten, and crucified. And yet what looked like the victory of evil became the means through which God accomplished salvation. The cross demonstrates something astonishing. God does not need evil to be good in order to defeat it. He can overcome evil without becoming evil, and Satan's greatest apparent victory became his greatest defeat. Jesus died, but Jesus rose again. Death was conquered, sin was defeated, and the powers of darkness could not stop God's plan. So perhaps the deeper question isn't simply one, why did God create Satan? It's, what does Satan's existence reveal about God? It reveals that God is sovereign even when evil is active. Satan is powerful, but he is not God's equal. He is a creature, not the creator. He is not omniscient. He is not omnipotent. He is not everywhere at once. The book of Job gives us a powerful picture of this. Satan can act, but only within limits God permits. He is never presented as an independent rival capable of threatening God's throne. That means the Christian story isn't a battle between two equal powers, good God versus evil Satan. That's not the biblical picture. God is sovereign. Satan is a defeated enemy whose final judgment is certain. Revelation 20 ultimately describes Satan's final defeat, and that gives us hope. Because the Bible's story doesn't end with evil winning. It ends with God making all things new. But there is one more question. If God knew Satan would rebel and knew humanity would fall, why create us at all? Why create a world where love could be rejected, obedience could be refused, and suffering could enter? Because the Bible reveals something greater than simply avoiding risk. God's purpose was redemption. Before we ever experienced the brokenness of sin, God had already planned salvation through Christ. The cross wasn't God's desperate reaction to a plan that had failed. It became the place where God's wisdom, justice, mercy, and love were revealed most clearly. The darkness was real. The suffering was real. The evil was real. But none of it was stronger than God's purpose. And perhaps that's what you need to remember when you look at the evil around you today. Satan is real. Temptation is real. Spiritual opposition is real. But Satan is not sovereign. He doesn't control the future. He doesn't sit beside God as an equal. And he will not win. God knew the rebellion would come. God knew the cost. And yet he also knew the end of the story. Christ would come. The cross would happen. The tomb would become empty. And evil would ultimately be defeated. So why did God create Satan if he knew Satan would rebel? Scripture doesn't answer every detail of God's reasoning. But it gives us enough to know this: God did not create Satan evil. Satan chose rebellion. God permitted that rebellion for a time, but never surrendered his sovereignty to it. And through Christ, God is bringing his creation toward a final victory over sin, death, and evil. The enemy may be active today, but his future is already decided. And that means the believer doesn't have to live terrified of darkness. We can trust the God who sees the entire story when we can only see one chapter. So here's the question. Does knowing that Satan is ultimately defeated change the way you think about spiritual opposition and evil in your own life? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring Christianity's deepest questions through Scripture, consider subscribing. Because sometimes the hardest questions don't have simple answer.